is we wanted to deal with the other great political event, and that was the signing of the Good Friday Agreement, and evaluate its impact upon the political balance of forces, the direction of republicanism in this state and on the island of Ireland, and to see what lessons can be learned or need to be learned from this whole process. There's a range of opinions from the Good Friday Agreement is as broad as the number of organisations who are in favour of it or opposed to it. We've all gone through the 25th anniversary, and the great and the good of the world has passed through Dublin Airport or Belfast, praising it's a great solution to all our problems, but not just as a great solution to the problems of Ireland, but it's actually now applicable to all over the world, almost as a solution to all problems. So there is an importance that we try to evaluate it in a way that we try to, learn from the mistakes, learn from what has happened, and how do we try to build something forward which takes on board these, what we might say, evaluations of the impacts of the Good Friday Agreement, the whole question of generations of Republicans who have either died in prison, some have now gone with the whole Good Friday process, believing that it's going to deliver what they fought for on the streets or in the prisons. There's other generation of Republicans who think that is complete and nothing with what they fought for and what those prisoners died for, what they struggled for. So it's important that we try to have an evaluation of the situation in an open and frank manner. So having done that, the forum decided that we'd invite Fearghal to come along. He's written extensively on this whole subject, on the question of what in the north, the 6 counties over the last 25 years and before. And I think it should be an interesting paper, following on from the earlier discussion. So it'd be good if I think it'd be stimulating. It's important that we do actually stimulate ideas, push forward, push the boundaries of our own knowledge out there, and see what is new, what is different, and see how we build on it. So Fearghal, I throw the floor open to Fearghal.
So it's more an honour to have joined you, because there's only a couple of focal and Gaelic can go much a club na mútery agus ní lani mé raile is geirig ar ogla na dagan beidir nó bhín gid in the nation rot ha mé rá ach so this talk is hopefully going to be as short as I am. We're going to look at the Good Friday Agreement, and what I'll do is I'll do a very as brief as possible assessment of the Good Friday Agreement, and I'd speak to one of the points that was made earlier on in terms of the potentialities of the Good Friday Agreement, and perhaps telling a room full of socialists and Marxists and communists that just because something is written in an international agreement doesn't mean it's going to be implemented. Probably doesn't need to be said. But let's look here. We have Father Ted Crilley, Barry Ahern, George Mitchell, allegedly, and the Butcher of Baghdad. And these people have essentially been using the Good Friday Agreement to launder their reputation. This is what's been happening for the past 25 years. One, because he wants to be the next president. Another, because cases are pending. And the other, because he's led to turning the Middle East into an open wound. Okay? So, what I will say about the Good Friday Agreement is that it's based on the Mitchell principles. The Mitchell principles are essentially that you shouldn't use political violence and you should just pursue constitutional means in the Dominion O'Connell sense of the word. Now, I really like the Mitchell principles, but I want them to be extended from the island of Ireland, because there seems to be, don't worry about the sea border in terms of trade, there's a Mitchell principles border around the island of Ireland, because these people here operate massive levels of political violence all over the world, but they say in Ireland it's nice, because you don't achieve your aims by political violence. So it's what I talked about earlier on in terms of that tension between the hypocrisy about what 100 years ago the British as the global hegemon and largest imperial power presented to the world as itself in terms of PR. It was called propaganda, and then in America it was turned into public relations by the nephew of Sigmund Freud, tells you a lot. And then what the current global hegemon, the United States of America, they're represented by George Mitchell, presents itself as. So, and again, I don't need to labour this point, but what was agreed in terms of the Good Friday Agreement and political documents and international treaties, their meaning and implications change over time. Okay? So this is, to me, is the key point in the Good Friday Agreement. It says that it is for the people of Ireland alone, by agreement between the two parts respectively, and without external impediment. That's Britain. Okay? It's for the people of Ireland alone to exercise their right of self-determination on the basis of consent freely and concurrently given north and south to bring about a united Ireland, accepting that this right must be achieved and exercised with and subject to the agreement and consent. Now, the way that this is phrased is very key. Of a majority of the people of Northern Ireland. Okay? Now that meant something very different in 1988 than it means in 2023. But the key point is this. You hear a lot about this idea about constructive ambiguity. The term, the self-determination of the whole people of Ireland, was the window dressing for the acceptance of the principle of consent in 1998. It was a means by which the Republican movement, which had denied the legitimacy of partition and the treaty that implemented it, and of British rule in Ireland, could camouflage its acceptance of the constitutional settlement 100 years ago that we talked about. Okay? So, the way that this was articulated was that, and in a nearly echo of Michael Collins, that this wasn't the freedom that we all desired, but it was the freedom to achieve freedom. Okay? And by degree, through our long march, and they're about to use Maoist language and stuff, quote Ho Chi Minh and stuff, our long march through the institutions, Chucky Orla. Okay? Now, the thing about this which is really significant is that the meaning of the last sentence has changed. Subject to the agreement and consent of the majority of the people of Northern Ireland. In 1988, that was a unionist veto. In legal terms now, it means 50% plus one. And this is essentially why the conditions exist constitutionally to use the mechanisms of the Good Friday Agreement to end partition. I would confidently predict that it probably will happen before the end of this decade. It's on record there. Okay. Now, this one here, without external impediment and the people of Ireland and self-determination, this is what Brexit was not primarily, but partially about. The whole furore about the protocol was the fact that in 1988, the British state, in an international agreement, ceded sovereignty over the 6 counties to the people of Ireland, subject to the principle of consent. Nowhere in this does it say that the British government has the right to govern Ireland. We heard this before, then. No selfish, is there a comma on there? Strategic or economic interest in Ireland, right? So that means something different today because it's quite clear now from the election results that that entrenched unionist majority is gone, right? So legalistically, it can happen. Now, as we already know, and we might see in a wee minute or two, that doesn't automatically mean that the British government will adhere to its international agreements. You know, you have to be living in a hole somewhere not to notice that the British state tends to, you know, have a flexible interpretation of its treaty or obligations. And you can... Well, can we hear? Yeah? Yeah. So, what we get then is the same thing happened in 1921. We were talking there about the institution of partition. Article 12 of the treaty said that the boundary would be revised in line with the wishes of the inhabitants and economic conditions. Right? That's what Lloyd George sold to Arthur Griffith, sold to Michael Collins, sold it to Arthur Griffith with lots of glasses of whiskey. Right? And that's what Arthur Griffith, when he signed his famous memorandum promising that he wouldn't stand in the way of an agreement because of the Boundary Commission, believed. He wrote a letter to De Valera, said they get thrown for Fermanagh, Derry City, Newry and South Armagh. In the event they got nothing, right? Perfidious Albion. The difference then and now, obviously, is that Britain is no longer in the same formidable position as it was 100 years ago. The other great difference is this. This is the map of the district electoral divisions that I've stolen from Twitter today, and it shows the largest party in the local government district election divisions, right? I don't know the final result, but it looks as if Sinn Féin is going to top over 30% of the vote. They're going to be the largest party, and they're going to enter Stormont if it's rejigged, and the chances are it's going to be rejigged. And its trajectory is very much that it's in the process now of managing the end of partition and creating, it's very seldom called the United Ireland anymore, it's usually called a New Ireland, right? So the first thing about this is that Sinn Féin is, possibly since Brexit, an incredibly successful political and electoral organisation. Right? They've created a coalition in the north, and they're creating a massive coalition in the south, right? And we've talked about the difference between objective and subjective agency. The reasons why this has happened, I would argue, haven't as much to do with the strategy that they cooked up in a kitchen somewhere in Andytown in the 1980s, and has a lot to do with the implications of the financial crisis and Brexit. And that the reason why they're riding high in terms of support is because of different types, but equally important, social discontent among crucial demographics, north and south. Right? That the southern electorate have tried every other alternative sort of left wing before they tried Sinn Féin. Yeah? Sinn Féin's support in the south is because of a breach of the social contract. Right? The social contract that Bertie and the boys had to develop was that you bought your house, that was your equity, and you went up the housing ladder, and now there's a disconnect in that. Okay? And you have a very youthful population which is earning an awful lot of money for the exchequer, creating an awful lot of wealth, can't buy their own homes, they don't have sufficient public services, and this is having, and Sinn Féin is riding on the crest of that wave. Right? In the north, it's slightly different. In the north, you essentially have a society that is, in an awful lot of indicators, poorer than it was in 1998. And across an awful lot of indicators, the people who are suffering most from this, ironically, are the very Republican communities that carried the provisional movement during the conflict, the working class communities. Now, the point here, and the point that I want to make, is that I know an awful lot of people in these working class communities, and a lot of them are convinced they are Republican. They say they're Republican socialists, and they want to create a 32-county socialist republic, and they view Sinn Féin as the best means of doing it. Right? My argument would be that history might suggest that you can't ride two horses. Right? You can't have solidarity for Cuba on one hand and express solidarity for the Palestinians, and then be networking political with the British royalty and be best mates with Joe Biden. Okay? That you can't triangulate your way to overcoming the contradictions of capitalism. You can't do it. Somewhere along the line, you have to make your choice. Just like Michael Collins had to make his choice the 28th of June. Hopefully it'll not be a choice that will be made validly, but just in the contradictions within the system will eventually make you decide which side are you on. You can't fudge it, you can't have constructive ambiguity. Somewhere down the line, a choice is going to be made. Unfortunately, my prediction will be that they're going to choose Joe Biden and Ursula von der Leyen, and they're going to abandon working class people. I would like to be wrong. I would like to be wrong. But if we look at the conduct and the extent to which the Good Friday Agreement operated, their historical precedent in the North would suggest that they're going to side with capital, and they're going to basically compromise on fundamentals. Now, this is Peter Monaldson. I put Peter Monaldson up there partially because I like having a dig at Peter Monaldson, but also because a lot of their strategy is based on the same thinking that operated under New Labour. Peter Monaldson said that about the people, the miners of South Wales, he says they will always vote Labour because they've nowhere else to go. Well, South Wales and the Red Wall found somewhere else to go because they were carried along and they were essentially politically abandoned. Now, Monaldson also had quite a negative input into the peace process. Right? Jonathan Powell, who used to write his speeches for Gerry Adams, he sought to cultivate unionists, and he was the first person to break the Good Friday Agreement. Monaldson, as Secretary of State, suspended the Assembly. And the Good Friday Agreement, the Secretary of State didn't have the power to do it, and they used the British Parliament in order to overrule the Good Friday Agreement. Richard Humphreys, who's a High Court judge here, in 2018, this is from Jeff Bell's excellent The Twilight of Unionism, if anybody wants to read it, said that there were 25 bodies constituted under the terms of the Good Friday Agreement. Half of them only partially operated, but more commonly weren't even set up. Right, so this great thing that we're celebrating, okay, has never really properly operated. Over half were not functioning or never established. I go through the list. The Oral History Archive, the Historical Investigations Unit, the Independent Commission on Information Retrieval and the Implementation and Reconciliation Group. The All-Ireland Civic Forum was downgraded to the Civic Advisory Panel, but even this never met. The North-South Independent Consultative Forum. I don't need to go on about the Irish Language Act, because everybody's heard about it. I would like to add, however, that the Irish Language Act, despite the unionist press, it's the achievement of the Cultural Act has a lot more to do with grassroots democratic mobilisation ulterior to Sinn Féin than it has to do with Sinn Féin as a party. And I say that from personal experience. And the non-existent Bill of Rights. So even by its own terms, the Good Friday Agreement hasn't really operated. Okay? On top of that, the Assembly has hardly functioned for half of its life. Right? There's a great thing you say in Irish, ní aimín and feminist. Right? It's an executive that doesn't execute. Right? It's an executive that doesn't operate. Now, another thing about this is that as part of their acceptance of the structures of the Good Friday Agreement, Sinn Féin essentially accepted the neoliberal reading of the way that the state was to intervene in the economy, and it also accepted after 2008, under protest but did implement, austerity, mass austerity. So, what you got then was, you didn't get a type of Irish republicanism made out, you get a type of electoral Hibernianism, where in essence the job of Sinn Féin was to allocate on a denominational basis the scarce resources of the state, to cut deals with the DUP up in Stormont, and then to present what they were achieving for their community as, you know, them fighting on their side. The problem with this was that the resources at hand were declining all the time. It also that out of the 10 most deprived areas in the north today, 9 of them are in majority nationalist areas. This is the election result for in Sligo, the Black Mountain, which contained Old White Rock 1 and 2, is the most deprived area in the north. That's the result the other day. Actually lost the Socialist councillor. Now, the point about this is that despite the fact that Sinn Féin has provided little or nothing to these communities, and their resources or their living conditions are arguably worse at the minute during the cost of living crisis. I don't remember any food banks in the north in 1998. Okay? They're still pinning their hopes on Sinn Féin. And the reason why they're pinning their hopes on them is that very thing we were talking about earlier on today. The ambiguity at the centre of what they stand for. Are they a popular democratic mass movement, pledged to the reconquest of Ireland? They're going to tackle property, they're going to get the grips with labour relations, and they're going to provide something for the working class, or are they going to be carried into the power on the back of the working class and expectation and let the people down? Well, I suggest that their record in terms of the Good Friday Agreement, and even their record in the South when they bailed out the banks, they agreed to bail out the banks, remember, suggests that they will compromise on principle in order to make short-term electoral gain. And as Rosa Luxemburg said, what appears to characterise this practice above all, this practice by reformists within the German Social Democratic Party, but we maybe compare Sinn Féin to them, is a certain hostility to theory. This is quite natural, for our theory, that is, the principles of scientific socialism, impose clearly marked limitations to practical activity. So the argument I would make, people turn around and say, why are you criticising Sinn Féin? What do you propose, or what do you think you should do? Politics is about pragmatism. It's about adopting a pragmatic position in terms of the prevailing conditions. But it's from within the pivot and the bedrock of your principles and your analysis. And the unfortunate thing would be that it appears that Sinn Féin laps an awful lot in terms of operating from a principled pivot. And I wrote a blog the other week, and I give them a Republican report card. So a lot there earlier on, we said, we can't define Republicanism. Give me 5 minutes and I'll try. Right? In terms of classical civic Republicanism, right, this is about sacrificing yourself, civic virtue, for the general good. Right? So it begins with the individual. And Rousseau said virtue is a state of war, and to live in it means one always has some battle to wage against oneself. So what are the implications of this? Where you move towards vice, the opposite of virtue, is that you begin to subvert democracy and you begin to carry out policy behind closed doors in an environment which will lead to vice and corruption. Now, anyone who's lived in the north and saw what happened before Mark McGuinness pulled the Stormont Assembly down will know what I'm talking about. Okay? Now, I'm not for a minute accusing Sinn Féin as being as bad as the DUP in terms of just endemic corruption. But there's a list as long as your arm. Red Sky, the Isle of Man, Lockkeepers' Cottages, etc., right? The first step towards vice is to shroud innocent actions in mystery, and whoever likes to conceal something sooner or later has reason to conceal it. And this is the thing. The nod and the wink, and we're going to go over to the coronation, but you want to know something? It's all right. We don't really like the king. We're still Republicans, And then we're going to go and we'll give Joe Biden a bowl of shamrock on St. Paddy's Day, and then we'll get the closest flight to Havana, and we'll be making Cuba Libres in the morning. Right? This is symptomatic of something far more systemic and troubling. This is symptomatic of a type of politics which is the negation of republicanism in the classical sense and is on the road to being undemocratic. So what do I mean by undemocratic? That is democracy. That's democracy in the liberal democratic sense, or as Bernie Sanders would call it, the best democracy that money can buy. Right? Now, republicanism, and there's the definition that runs from 1798 right the way through, is the willingness to sacrifice yourself for the common good. And it found expression in that document that nobody apparently read, the 1916 Proclamation. It's the readiness of its children to sacrifice themselves for the common good and thereby prove itself worthy of the august destiny to which it is called. So, I would say they fail the civic Republican test, the classical Republican test. I think the Good Friday Agreement is a sectarian trap that has essentially meant abandoning one of the core concepts of Irish republicanism for short-term political gain. Again, you will be told, yes, but what's your alternative? And look how well we're doing now. Yeah, 25 years later. The alignment of political forces, which has very little to do with the strategy that they enacted a generation ago, means you're now in the electoral ascendant. Chances are, if you had have engaged in a principled anti-sectarian type of politics for 25 years, you probably would be receiving the same amount of electoral support. So, what the above tone say, and this is a key point, is this idea that somehow Irish Protestants are unique within the human race. They're not allowed to change their mind. They are immutably born loyalist and reactionary. It's a strange sort of, and it's a strain of DNA that's never been found, by the way. Right? The whole concept of Irish republicanism, and again, I'll define it again, and this hasn't changed, and anybody who said they were Republican in the intervening period and didn't believe this wasn't actually a Republican, was that republicanism is not nationalism in the ethnic or religious sense. Republicanism, here we go. Republicanism stems from the application of the radical enlightenment, right? Radical enlightenment to a colonial context. It was a recognition by members of the colonial community, the colonists, that the nation that they sought to create was a new civic nation based on universal rights. It wasn't a Catholic nation, it wasn't a Protestant nation, it was a civic nation based on them concepts I outlined in terms of Rousseau. Were these people dyed in the wool so to snow? Although you could maybe argue that about Thomas Russell. Okay? But the entire thing was premised on the transcendence of the conquest and division. Are we forever to walk like beasts of prey over fields which our ancestors stained with blood? The Good Friday Agreement is like building nuclear weapons in the 1950s in the United States of America. Mutually assured destruction. How do you avert a nuclear war? Build more nuclear bombs. Explain that to a 7-year-old. How do you end sectarianism in Ireland? Base your constitutional setup on the institutionalisation of sectarianism. Because Protestants are just immutable, non-thinking beings who follow drums and wear sashes. Okay? And even if the majority of Irish Protestants still saw themselves as British, even though they've lived here for 400 years. That does not give them the right to subvert Irish self-determination. And what in the name of God would you base your entire political outlook and constitutional future on the accommodation of reactionary colonial settler supremacism? Right? It's, and it also has been used as a proxy and a shield by the southern political establishment not to talk about end partition. Oh, the poor unionists. Try living with them. So anyway, so they've failed. See, the same supremacist ideas that underpin an awful loyalism are the same chauvinistic nationalist ideas that have maniacs running about with Irish Republican flags attacking refugees. It's the same chauvinism, but with a different coloured flag. That's not republicanism. Now, then they had the Socialist Republican test, and, well, if they failed the other two, they flunked this one. Okay, we know all about Connolly, but I actually got this from Conor McNamara's Twitter feed, and I thought I'd read it out to you. And instead of explaining it, I'd let you make up your own mind, because, I don't think you're Ulster Protestants. All right? This is what Connolly wrote in 1898, and I think it's a perfect counter to an awful lot of what my friends in Sinn Féin, these people have a lot of time and regard for, but I just don't agree with. There's no animosity. As I said, I have a shinner any day of the week before a blue short or a Fianna Fáiler. But see if it works. Oh. Right. So this is about people who say you need to be pragmatic and practical. Let us be practical. We want something practical, always the cry of human mediocrity, afraid to face the stern necessity for uncompromising action. The above quoted saying has done more yeoman service in the cause of oppression than all it avowed supporters. The average man dislikes to be thought unpractical, and so, very frequently loathing the principles and distrusting the leaders of a particular political party he is associated with, declines to leave them in hope that their very lack of earnestness may be more fruitful of political results than the honest unspokenness of the party whose principles he does believe. A party totally, and this is what Connolly calls for, a party totally indifferent to the personality of leaders or questions of leadership, but hot to enthusiasm on every question affecting the well-being of the toiling masses, is an extreme, a dangerous party. Yeah? Sinn Féin used to be an extreme and dangerous party. I think not. Yet, although it may seem a paradox to say so, there is no party so incapable of achieving practical results as an orthodox practical party, and there is no party so certain of placing moderate reforms to its credit as an extreme, a revolutionary party. So the big concern here is that Sinn Féin is going to enter power. It's in power in the north, it's going to enter power in the south, neutered of any revolutionary intent before it even gets anywhere near, triangulating its way to impotence and riding in on the back of massive public expectation and letting it down. And as Peter Mandelson said, they've nowhere else to go. Well, they do. They'll go to the same place in Ireland as they went in Britain. They'll be joining the attacks on the refugees, and they'll be going to the extreme right. Now, this is very pessimistic, but this is where people say, what are you going to do? Well, then you have to engage in a principled Republican Socialist response to this, and you have to appeal to the people within that movement to keep that movement straight, and you have to have a popular movement to make sure that there be no backsliding on promises, and that the Ireland that they're promising everybody is the Ireland that's delivered and then some. The possessing classes will and do laugh to scorn every scheme for the amelioration of the workers so long as those responsible for the initiation of the scheme admit as justifiable the rights of property. But when the public attention is directed towards questioning the justifiable nature of those rights in themselves, then the master class, alarmed for the safety of their booty, that should say, yield reform after reform in order to prevent revolution. What's the moral? Don't be practical in politics. To be practical in that sense means that you have schooled yourself to think along the lines and in the grooves those who rob you would desire you to think. In any case, it is time we got rid of all the cant of politics and constitutional agitation in general, for there is really no meaning whatever in those phrases. The labour question cannot be settled except by measures which necessitate a revision of the whole system of society. which of course implies political warfare to secure the power to effect such revision. So if Sinn Féin want to solve the labour question, and Sinn Féin want to create a workers' republic, they're going to have to, at some point, break with the triangulation and the glad handing and the trips to Washington. Either that or stop calling yourself Republican Socialist, and then a lot of the very genuine supporters that they have might look somewhere else. Or get into power, and then the Republican Socialist people in Ireland try and keep them straight. Okay? To effect its emancipation, Labour must reorganise society on the basis of labour. This cannot be done when the slideshow breaks down. The revolution would have succeeded only for the HDMI cable. Yeah. This cannot be done while the forces of government are in the hands of the rich. Therefore, the government's governing power must be wrested from the hands of the rich, peaceably if possible, forcibly if necessary. I might just very quickly talk about, what was achieved and another differentiation between republicanism and constitutional nationalism. It's a false dichotomy that is created by constitutional nationalists, going all the way back to Daniel O'Connell. And Daniel O'Connell is a classic exponent of constitutional nationalism, because what is it? It's assimilationism. It's assimilation to the conquest and carving out a niche in class terms for an indigenous bourgeoisie within that framework. And how do you do that there? Well, you, as I said before, treat the people like mushrooms. Feed them shit and keep them in the dark. Okay? So that assimilationist tendency posited the divergence between constitutional nationalism and republicanism as a difference between moral force and physical force. Right? But that dichotomy was a false dichotomy. And when was it exposed? It was exposed in September 1914, when John Redmond told them to go wherever the firing line extends and engage in industrialised slaughter on the continent. 33,000 Irish people died in the First World War, far less died in the War of Independence. So it's a false dichotomy. What then shall we say to our constitutional agitators and their constitutional claptrap? Let us be peaceful by all means, but let us not prate too much about being constitutional. For if we cannot secure justice within the Constitution, shall we cease to seek after it? Right? So don't be back in special criminal courts because you think it's politically expedient. Right? Stick to Republican principles, gain mass democratic support, and then when the divergence comes, be on the right side. And the right side, if you're a socialist, is always the side of the working class, the majority of society. Right? And politics isn't always black and white, but since 2008, and I think everybody in this room has got a sense of it, is that the tectonic plates of politics are changing, and we're approaching some sort of crisis. Right? It is against the Constitution, and now people will then go, sure, that's, whiff of cordite, and this is all, everybody go out and start up a revolutionary organisation. I like what Connolly had to say about that. That's not automatically the alternative to saying that constitutional nationalism is defective. It isn't to engage in the same false dichotomy. It's not to believe the person who's labelling you. This is what Connolly says about that. He says, it is against the Constitution to join a Republican secret society, but it is also against the Constitution to keep a dog without a licence. The romance which might attach to the former is cruelly dissipated by the reflection that the law is as remorseless in hunting down the offender in the latter. Right? So this, again, looking at the Good Friday Agreement, right? The Good Friday Agreement is, to my mind, has been a trap. It's been a trap for genuine socialist Republican politics. Right? It's not about renegotiating the conquest, assimilating, cutting side deals, going into PESCO, the Orwellian partnership for peace, abandoning Irish neutrality. The majority of people in the island of Ireland do not want to join NATO. They want the country to be neutral, and they want the creation of a republic that was promised 100 years ago and was designed in the mind of Irish Protestants 200 years ago. And that's a republic based on universal rights in which there is genuine democracy. Not Sky News democracy, not BBC democracy, the garbage that you're told, but the deeds are done in the back rooms, but genuine open democracy based on non-egotistical civic republicanism. So the big thing that I'll finish with is that we are not out, okay, for repeal. James Fitton Lawler, and there's Connolly's, the cover to his, The Reconquest of Ireland. They don't want the repeal of the Union then, but to repeal the conquest. Not to disturb or dismantle the empire, but to abolish it forever. Not to fall back on 82 and Henry Grattan and Arthur Griffith later on, but act up to 48. Not to resume or restore an old constitution, but to found a new nation and raise up a free people, and strong as well as free, and secure as well as strong, based on a peasantry rooted like rocks in the soil of the land, hopefully next door to publicly state-owned and democratically controlled massive renewable energy resources. This is my object. Gora Céimeann Maith.